Hi, everyone. So welcome to the David Graeber Institute continuation of the research around Bakhtin. And today we're very, very happy to introduce Benjamin Paloff, a writer and a professor of Slavic literature at the University of Michigan. His works focus on Eastern European literature, questions of narrative, time, and ethics, and the ways we imagine the lives and freedoms of others. And so, of course, he's an ideal person for us to talk about Mikhail Bakhtin, our long-standing interest in Carnival. And now, Benjamin, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nika. I want to begin by expressing my thanks to the David Graeber Institute and the Museum of Care, Nika, Koshika, Shlomo, and everyone else involved in making this event possible. Forgive my rather generic setting. I'm in a hotel room in Cambridge because I came to the UK for a talk that I gave yesterday. I am properly attired, though, insofar as I'm wearing my Bakhtin T-shirt, which was a present, a Hanukkah present from my children who understand my interests perhaps too well. So I'm going to spend about a half hour, a little more than a half hour, talking with you about this book, Bakhtin's Adventure, and how it came to be. It is a fairly short book for those of you who don't want to read necessarily something very dense and long. And it's also written for a non-specialist audience. When I say short, it's just under 100 pages, not including notes. It reflects roughly a quarter century of my engagement with this particular thinker, Mikhail Bakhtin, who has had a profound influence not only on how I read and write, which is what I do for a living, but also how, quite frankly, and at the risk of grandiosity, he's had a profound influence on how I exist in the world. He's really helped shape my understanding of ethics and its applications in socio-political life, which sounds like a lot when we're considering Mikhail Bakhtin as someone who, if you were to read about him in most any biographical encyclopedia or dictionary, is presented generally as a literary scholar, sometimes as a literary critic, often as a linguist, which is perhaps farthest away from what he actually did, and quite often as a philosopher. He rejected all of those titles directly. He preferred the term thinker, which at least is fairly close to philosopher, but his objection was that in his life, in his experience, which covers the entire history of the Soviet Union, the decades prior to the Soviet Union, and all the way up until 1975. He died in the mid-70s. He refused to be called a philosopher, in part because his understanding of what that word meant was very much institutionalized within the expectations of Soviet academia. And so philosopher for him meant generally someone doing very technical work in Marxist or Hegelian philosophy, whereas what he was interested in was thinking through the data of human experience and how we understand the lives of others. That in itself is not how most people in the English-speaking world, and in fact in the Russian-speaking world to some extent as well, but definitely in the English-speaking world, we don't generally think of Bakhtin in this way. We think of him as a literary critic or a literary scholar or a literary philosopher. That is in itself a kind of trick of fate. The first books, and excuse me if my voice is very rough or cracking. I've been talking a lot these last few days. But his first books to enter English circulation, and still the books that are most well known, widely used and studied in academia, are two titles. One is Rabelais in his World, which is in English almost summary type of title. The actual title of that book in Russian is much longer and doesn't refer to the world, but actually refers to the consciousness of medieval culture. The other book is Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics, which again kind of simplifies what the story of that particular book is, because in fact Bakhtin wrote that book in its first version in the end of the 1920s, and by the time the book was released, he had already been arrested by Stalin's henchmen, and so that book in itself represents a rather unusual circumstance for a Soviet author. Generally, if you were under arrest, your book was not going to be made available, but somehow his book actually came out while he was under arrest. That book was actually called originally Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetic or Creative Work, Проблемы творчества Достоевского in Russian. What later became Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics was a revision from 1963 in which he thoroughly reimagined certain sections. And what is that? That's the version that's translated into English as Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics. That's my introduction to Bakhtin, not for you, but for me, in fact, because as a student of Russian literature in the 1990s, I was introduced to Bakhtin's writings again in that literary scholarly context. I was studying 19th century Russian literature. Inevitably, that means, of course, studying Dostoevsky. And then as you advanced, you're introduced to the major thinkers and writers on your author. And of course, Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics was at least mentioned often, although very few undergraduates were reading it at the time. I was rather fascinated by the book. The book grabbed me, excited me, and really confused me. And so I began reading and rereading not just that book, but much of Bakhtin's work over the course of my graduate studies, undergraduate, graduate studies, and then just kind of kept going down the rabbit hole as I got older. And that's why this has been going on now for, when I said a quarter century, I'm actually kind of lowballing it. It's closer to 30 years of reading this man's work and trying to grapple with it. In particular, what that means for me is grappling with a kind of an idea like this one, which appears in Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics. Bakhtin tells us that for an author like Dostoevsky, whom he sees as a pivot point, a kind of change figure in the history of the European novel, he says in that book that it is in Dostoevsky's work that we sometimes witness the author observing his characters at the cross section of a single moment and then guessing at the relationship between the characters' actions and lives within that simultaneity. This really, really stunned me when I read it for the first time and really quite confused me. What it effectively meant was that Bakhtin is a kind of reader who believes that the lives of the characters in Dostoevsky's novels exist and operate independently of the narrative design of Dostoevsky himself. This represents a strain in thinking about the European novel that actually then it has a slight, not very long prehistory. It begins with the Hungarian Marxist critic Georg Lukács. In fact, Bakhtin had undertaken a translation of Lukács's theory of the novel in the early 1920s and then abandoned it when Lukács refused to assign the rights, because Lukács as a Marxist critic who is repeatedly reinventing himself, had lost faith in the book itself. I think he's wrong, and Bakhtin did as well. But the idea is that Bakhtin picked up this idea from Lukács. In Lukács's theory of the novel, he describes a notion of the European novel as being a space in which we see the development of the potentials of what a human being can be, but with the rise of realism and the need for authors to represent characters who themselves represented certain ideas or social realities. Lukács suggests that, in fact, that potential of the novel as a space for imagining the potential lives of others effectively gets derailed. So when Lukács is doing this, he begins at the roots of the European novel. In fact, into the prehistory of the European novel, he begins with Dante, and then he really gets firing when he is writing about Cervantes. And Cervantes is actually a great example of this idea of the novel. If you read Don Quixote, it's a wonderful book, but it's not really about anything. It simply portrays a man who has read so many chivalric romances that as he is entering his own dotage and losing his grip on reality, as he's becoming senile, he begins to identify the reality materially present around him with all of the things he has populated his mind with, all of the things he read. And so you get this novel of free-form adventure with no particular end goal, no particular purpose. It is both a satire of a picaresque adventure, just the picaro, just wandering from little episode to episode, and at the same time, a representative, in some ways, an apotheosis of that novelistic adventure tradition. But for Lukács, that had basically been shut down by the impositions of the Enlightenment novel, which was very much idea-driven, with characters representing particular ideas or attitudes, and then really quite shut down by the realist novel in the 19th century, where the political, social, or moral needs of the author are effectively animated in these characters who, for writers like Lukács or Bakhtin, they're like marionettes on strings, right? That there's an author who is the master of this world that he's creating, and that narrative universe is a kind of diorama where he's moving the pieces in order to represent very, very specific ideas or visions of the world. This is what Milan Kundera, the Czech novelist who comes after Bakhtin, and in fact also just passed away quite recently. In his book, in the first book he wrote in French after his exile from Czechoslovakia. His first book in French is from the mid-1980s and is called The Art of the Novel. Sounds like a very distinct echo of Lukács. In fact, it is a very distinct echo of Lukács, because if you do read his very early work, Kundera's early work, there is another book called The Art of the Novel that was never translated into English. Same title, quite a different book, but with a very similar argument. And the argument is about what he refers to as the depreciated legacy of Cervantes. There are interesting political reasons for why Kundera might never have why he didn't mention Lukács at all in The Art of the Novel as we have it. It does seem very much like he's borrowed this big idea from someone else and then not attributed it, which is a big no-no in my line of work. And I also happen to know that in the Czech version that I've read, again, it's not exactly a version, it's a different book under the same title, but with similar arguments. There he does specifically reference Lukács as helping him formulate this notion of the depreciated legacy of Cervantes. For Kundera, there are novels in the 20th century that in fact recover that spirit of pure adventure, where the characters don't simply represent ideas and are not simply the puppets of the authorial design, but seem to exist as fully formed human beings within a text. And so in Kundra's telling, writers who pick up the thread of this depreciated legacy might include James Joyce. Think specifically of Ulysses, which is a novel of aimless adventure. Proust, Thomas Mann, Witold Gombrowicz, the Polish modernist novelist as well. And so if you read these three thinkers, writers, Georgi Lukács, Michal Bakhtin, Milan Kundera, you can actually see across the 20th century an effort to reimagine what the novel could have been or might have been if it had maintained that idea of the text as its own self-contained, perhaps, but nevertheless real and vibrant universe, where people can exist as people, where, as Lukács says, where man can exist as man, that is, not as a puppet, not as a symbol. The interesting thing with regard to Dostoevsky is that it's only in the last paragraph of that book, of the art of, or the theory of the novel, that Lukács says, speculatively, it is perhaps in the works of Dostoevsky that this depreciated legacy of adventure storytelling is again revitalized. And then he just kind of, drops the mic. Bakhtin picks it up. But that nevertheless did not necessarily clarify for me what he was talking about when he said that the author is looking at his characters and imagining the interrelationship between them and their actions in the cross-section of a single moment. That's a very perplexing idea, not just for any literary authorship, because we know the author is planning, controlling, cutting, editing, moving, rethinking, that there is authorial design, there is authorial intention. It's especially more difficult with a writer like Dostoevsky, who left an enormous corpus of journalistic writings, notes, drafts that very, very clearly outline the conceptual purpose of his narrative designs. That is, his novels are very tightly plotted. His characters are often emblematic of certain ideas or social positions. In fact, his characters very often have names that would seem to define those social positions. This is something that Dostoevsky picks up from other realist novelists of the era, most especially Charles Dickens, who is, of course, a master at inventing words like Scrooge, where the word Scrooge would in fact enter the American and English lexicons as a character type. And you might describe someone as being Scrooge-y, for example, right? And of course, Dickens just makes up that word, but it really just somehow nails the character that he's trying to convey. The same is true of other characters from Dickens, like, say, Mr. and Mrs. Bumble from Oliver Twist, or for that matter, Oliver Twist itself. The name is emblematic of the character. Dostoevsky does the same thing. The murderer hero of Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov, his name comes from Raskol, which means schism. His best friend, who tries to talk him into thinking more reasonably, is Razumichin. Razum is reason. So there is a sense, especially in Dostoevsky, that authorial design is controlling this narrative universe. And so I, for a long time, in fact, wrote about this earlier in my career, thought of Bakhtin as having attempted with his literary writings to create a kind of liberational or emancipatory philosophy That is, how do you create freedom in an unfree system? This, of course, thematically resonated also just with the biography, that he's living in an oppressive regime. He actually becomes a victim of that regime just as he's finishing this book. And so it was something quite poignant, this idea that Dostoevsky himself is an unfree narrative system, but Bakhtin is able to invent the possibility of freedom within the most unfree system. I actually considered his choice of Dostoevsky as the exemplar of this way of approaching literature. I consider this to be something of a perverse or contrarian impulse on the part of Bakhtin. That is, in some sense, he chose the least free narrative system literary author to demonstrate the potency of the way of reading that he was proposing. There are lots of little quirks in that way of reading. If you do read Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics, which I highly recommend, you'll find, for example, that he has a whole chapter on plot, in which he does not discuss plot in any meaningful way. And this is an essential kind of tactic if you are arguing that Dostoevsky represents his characters in a free way, in a way that endows them with freedom, because it's in the tight plotting of the novels where person does X, person suffers consequence for X. That's where you see the moral and philosophical weight of the novels as argument. He is what Bakhtin does is to simply eliminate plot as a meaning generative function of the novel. So instead of really dwelling on how plot shows us that, in fact, Dostoevsky wanted to send very clear argumentative messages, Bakhtin simply ignores plot, and that's how you get this sense of Dostoevsky as effectively being plotless. My reading of that, my understanding of that has changed, and it changed rather profoundly a few years ago as I started approaching this book, Bakhtin's Adventure. I challenged myself in effect in working on this book to do something that is very easy to not to do, or in fact to ignore. Namely, it is very easy for us to take an idea, especially as students, frankly. We take an idea that is one that we read, or very often one that is presented to us by our teachers and our mentors, and we make allowances for that idea so that the idea makes sense. That's what we do when we say, well, I think what this means is. And so you can take this idea of, Bakhtin says that Dostoevsky is imagining what his characters are doing, imagining what the relationship between their actions is at the cross-section of a single moment. And then I had spun out elaborate arguments. Well, what I think that Bakhtin is saying is this, that, or the other thing. What I challenged myself to do several years ago with regard to this book, and now with several other projects that in fact have spun out of this and that are ongoing, is something I call taking the idea seriously. That is to say that when Bakhtin says that he thinks Dostoevsky is looking at his characters and not determining their behaviors, outcomes, or not necessarily even conveying their intentions, I got to a point where I was no longer making allowances or offering my own spin on what I thought that meant, and I started taking it seriously as meaning exactly what it says. This led me to a different kind of Bakhtin. I started reading, instead of just reading all of his work kind of haphazardly as one sometimes does as a student, picking up certain texts for certain purposes, I started reading him from the beginning to the end. This especially became possible, by the way, in a way that was not actually true. It wasn't possible for me when I was a student, because his work had appeared in different editions, and in English it had appeared very incompletely. But in the early 2000s, a Russian publisher published what I think is kind of the gold standard scholarly edition that of Bakhtin. It's in 6+ volumes, very thick volumes, very densely edited with tons of notes and references and drafts, and lots of texts that were not easily available in really any other form. And so I was working with that edition as well as with the English translations, and reading Bakhtin in the order that Bakhtin was writing Bakhtin. That is, reading from the very beginning of his career as a student all the way up to the end of his life in the order. And what I find is that the plotting, that is the order in which something is told, is very much as Bakhtin would tell us, and his contemporaries argue this very much. The meaning of a story is not in the story. Stories don't have meaning. Stories are just stuff that happens in a particular order. Plots have meaning because plot is the order in which something is told. And that is where we see an authorial intentionality. So I took plot out of it. Instead of reading Bakhtin in the order in which he had been presented to me as a literary scholar or literary thinker, that is, with books about Rabelais, about Dostoevsky. And that's the way we had been reading him in the Western world ever since the late 1960s, when he was rediscovered. In fact, when Bakhtin was rediscovered as an important thinker, most people in the West believed he was dead. It was something of a shock to learn that this man who had written this really important work in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, in fact, was still alive at that time. But Yulia Kristeva, the Bulgarian philosopher, psychoanalytic theorist in France, wrote a very important essay about Bakhtin in the late 1960s. And this was the text that effectively introduced this otherwise obscure Soviet academic, or aspiring academic, I should say. The Rabelais book, just side note, the Rabelais book was a dissertation and it was rejected. It was Kristeva who had introduced Bakhtin to the Western world, and she had introduced him as a literary thinker, literary critic, literary scholar, and so that's the way we saw him. However, if you go back and you read Bakhtin in order, that is, in the order of his writing, the order in which Bakhtin writes Bakhtin, what we find is that he's not actually thinking primarily about literary figures or literary texts at all. His main interest is in ethics, and specifically, his main interest is in the problem of how we, self-contained within our brains, our minds, possessing a consciousness that is far more vast than anything we are capable of recognizing in any other person, including those to whom we are most intimately connected. We simply will never have access to what they see. We will never be able to perceive from within their perceiving. We will never have access to their thoughts, feelings, to the extent that we are able to access that for ourselves. And this is Bakhtin's ethical project, to reassert the full personhood of each person in any world, whether that world is experiential. Right now, I'm experiencing me in this hotel room. You guys are experiencing yourselves. But also, what that world could simply be narrative. And the narrative plays an enormous role in our lives, whether we realize it or not. Excuse me. Just getting over a cold. And it is very rainy here in England. The challenge that Bakhtin throws at us in the whole arc of his writing life, and what I've now taken in my reading of Bakhtin, this is really what Bakhtin is about, is how to endow everyone else with the full personhood that we recognize in ourselves. And like I said, that occurs in experience, but also narrative, and not just like novels. Think of stories from your own family. You may have been familiar with some distant uncle who went off on some crazy adventures, grandparents you never met, cousins you're not familiar with in person, but you have some idea of who they are based on what you were told about them, about things they've done, about features of their character, their personality, their interests, their goals, their ambitions. And with that, you have formulated, we all do this, a mental image that is a kind of paper cutout of a human being. And so if you have some uncle you haven't seen in 30 years, nor are you interested in, because he's the idiot uncle who used to say stupid things around the dinner table, you have that idea of like, yeah, I have this one idiot uncle, and he's basically locked into that character that is in your mind. We certainly do this, for example, with political figures all the time, because we are exposed to them repeatedly, but we have no insight into what they're actually like in person, let alone their inner lives. And yet we formulate very rigid ideas of who they are, what their personality is. And in fact, at this point, I've become really quite cautious about referring to anyone's character. Whenever we say that someone has performed an act or done something that we find shocking or out of character, that is a clear indication to us that we actually have defined that person, that we had an idea of who they were. And when they simply go about being who they actually are, which may include doing things that we had not anticipated, then we say that they've somehow stepped out of their character. In fact, what they've done is simply been themselves. It is we who tend to impose the boundaries and definitions on other people, which for Bakhtin is perhaps the ultimate ethical failing, the failure to recognize another human being as a fully valid, robust, unknowable to themselves creature. Historical figures, of course, we do this all the time. Figures from cultural and religious pasts. People have very specific ideas of what Jesus of Nazareth wanted for us, didn't want for us, thought about, didn't think about. And those ideas are often quite dogmatic and quite rigid. But the real person is always capable of some unanticipated, spontaneous action. This is true if we do read to the beginning of Bakhtin up until Dostoevsky, so roughly the first 8 or 9 years of his writing life, almost all of the work is specifically about this idea of a human being, not about literature at all. The Dostoevsky book then introduces the literary problem, because that's a great test case, right? We read about characters and we start to invest in their well-being. We start to think about them, start to imagine what their lives and their world is. Bakhtin is suggesting to us throughout his work that we actually do that all the time. And we don't have to read any novels to do it. We do it with people, right? We tend to make people into characters in our narrative universe. And so he does provide us with some very specific tools for how to break ourselves out of that habit of mind, which of course is effectively impossible, but that's what ethical struggle is about. It's not ever to the completion of something. In fact, completion is something that is that Bakhtin is extremely skeptical of. He talks about, among his many conceptual keywords, he talks about things like unfinalizability. We as living creatures are unfinalized. Tomorrow brings other opportunities and dangers. We don't yet know how we will respond to them. We are not simply running some kind of behavioral algorithm. And yet, when we imagine other people, we impose those kinds of behavioral algorithms on them all the time, which is why we're always shocked when someone acts out of character. This ultimately led me to the conclusion, this actually surprised me quite a bit when I realized, at least in my own treatment of this writer that Bakhtin, in fact, has not been doing what I thought he was doing when I started. I thought that what he was doing was imagining literary characters as if they were real people. And I spent a couple of decades trying to untangle what the hell that could mean. And then I had something of an epiphany that was very much backed by what Bakhtin himself was writing. Taking the idea seriously meant that he wasn't imagining literary characters as if they were real people. He was pointing out and then analyzing how in our actual lives we are constantly imagining real people as if they were literary characters with a meaning, with a purpose, with a design, in some kind of plot. And so he reasserts the full potential of the human being and the dignity of a human being as the embodiment of an open future, an open-ended existence, a constantly unfolding present, as we ourselves experience the world as a constantly unfolding present. And so that's ultimately where I landed. And so I wrote this little book called Bakhtin's Adventure, an essay on life without meaning, which initially sounds rather pejorative. Who wants to live a meaningless life? I can now say quite specifically that I do. As soon as someone tells you what your life has meant, you are definitively dead. The life that is constantly unfolding into an ever-developing present has no meaning. There's no particular meaning to what I'm going to do when this lecture is over. There is not a prescription of the significance that my life or my existence ought to, should, or even does have. As long as I wish to be myself, I cannot simply be my labels, my roles, my titles, or the meaning that I hold for someone else. I need to be undefined, unfinalized, according to Bakhtin. The way I demonstrate this in the book is by using, as Bakhtin himself would like, textual examples that demonstrate this. Most of the textual examples I draw on are not ones that Bakhtin would have been familiar with, because I draw mostly on popular film and media from the years when I was grappling with these questions. So a great deal of my examples come from films like The Matrix, The Big Lebowski, Pulp Fiction, and other cinematic efforts to destabilize our sense of what the story is about in the first place. And I also look at some other media, but I try to structure this in a way that actually hits all of Bakhtin's conceptual keywords and puts them in what I believe is their actual proper place in this idea of a narrative ethics that re-endows a human being with their full human potential. And I think I'll conclude there. Thank you very much for your attention. I do hope that you will have some interest in the book, which was published by Northwestern University Press this year. And I'm very happy to meet with you. So thank you very much. Sorry, Nika, I think you're muted.
Yes, thank you so much. It was very exciting, especially for me, the last part about ethic of narrative and unfinished life. It's very political statements, I think. So maybe I should ask some questions now, if it's okay.
Please.
And I will start from Carnival, and from why do you think, or how would you describe how Bakhtin, who is a literature critic or philosopher, why is he started to get interested in the in the folk culture or in love, so on and so forth?
No, it's a great question. So the book Rabelais and His World is, as I mentioned, one of the two major texts that was in early circulation among mostly literary academics, beginning in the 1970s. And one could simply take that and think, okay, so so Bakhtin is a medievalist. He's writing about medieval culture, or even that you could say, oh, so Bakhtin is a scholar of early modern French or medieval French literature, which of course he was not. He wrote this dissertation on Rabelais in the 1930s and 40s. And his interest in Rabelais is twofold, I would say. One is that Rabelais is one of these authors who fits the mold of this depreciated legacy of Cervantes. So specifically, if we're looking at the works of Rabelais, which are collected in this rather sprawling text, telling the story of the adventures of two giants, Gargantua and Pantagruel, father, son, and they go off and they do various things that are utterly absurd and meaningless and pointless. And then they do the adventure, or one episode of the adventure, sometimes is referred to as a narrative kernel. It ends and then it repeats and then it repeats. And that's how these kinds of texts happen, right? So think of like Cervantes and Don Quixote. Don Quixote tilts at windmills, believing them to be giants. He gets terribly injured. He slowly recovers. He does recover. And then he sets off on the next misadventure. And so we see that structure very much in Rabelais. The other thing that Rabelais provides for Dostoevsky is a model for social existence that in fact models that same free form and in some ways meaningless activity. So Rabelais does provide us with a very interesting and almost sociological catalog of medieval behaviors, not least of which is Carnival, which I know has been of great importance to the Museum of Care and the David Graeber Institute. Carnivalesque behavior refers to, well, I guess one way of putting it would be acting the fool. We have carnivals still, not just in say national holidays or that sort of thing. Carnival here means, in fact, a suspension of the norms and rules of everyday behavior in a tightly ordered society. So a church carnival would typically be something like Mardi Gras, right? Or Fat Tuesday. So before the strict observance of religious ritual and really quite something so rule-bound that it penetrates the diet, this is a good representative of a suspension in time in which we're not going to do what's Lent, which is following strict rules, adopting ascetic behaviors, performing specific time-stamped rituals, as it were. Instead, we're going to do the exact opposite during Mardi Gras. We're going to act like fools. We're going to act irreligiously. Everything that is sacred, we're going to set aside so that we can really engage in the profane. So not instead of denying ourselves certain basic foods, we're in fact going to overindulge in sweets and drugs and alcohol, or when it's sex, carnal pleasures, right? Or Lent is an ascetic observance. Mardi Gras is the opposite. In the medieval context, the idea of carnival is that within a specific space and within the specific time marked on the calendar, the rules of the society will be inverted. So on the carnival square, there will be a king, and the king will be the fool, the most foolish person. will be crowned as the Carnival king. Instead of respecting authority, you can make fun of it all you like. Instead of respecting the norms and boundaries of everyday behavior, social custom, law, all of those will be inverted. However, it is a mistake. It is a common misconception that this is some kind of liberational notion of social organization. And the reason it's a mistake is because this is true both in the history of the practices of Carnival as well as in Bakhtin's writings. What Carnival does is to function as a kind of release valve for a society that is otherwise oppressed under rigid hierarchies, rules, norms. You don't get to act like yourself. You can't act on your desires. You can't act on your immediate impulses. You can't even speak your mind in everyday society. But on the Carnival Square, you can do all of those things. So that at the end of the Carnival period, the square goes back to being a market square. Carnival no longer exists. The fool is no longer king. The king is not a fool. One of the things that we find with Carnival practices that really hits home the idea of how unfree the societies in which they might occur happen to be is that look at what happens to all of the people who behave that way when they step off the Carnival Square or when it's not Carnival. If I'm a fool and I go around saying I'm the king and it's not Carnival, it's off with my head, right? So Carnival becomes this almost like a pressure valve. Nevertheless, in it, what we see is, and what everyone takes from it, including the king, is the arbitrariness of the hierarchies to begin with, right? If I can be king for a day, it means that the king who's king every other day could also be fool for a day. That these roles are arbitrary. And so that is an extremely important idea in Bakhtin that I think what you're doing by trying to enact Carnival practices is very laudable.
I think I disagree with you. I would quote David, who would say that so many revolution sectors started from Carnival. And it's also a very interesting question about time. So my understanding is that revolution, as I studied in my Soviet school, was explained, it was a bad times before revolution, then some good guys come together, do the right things. Then it was this event when everything went upside down one times as a one-day carnival, and then Soviet Union was born. And the whole history we were teaching is exactly through that like linear timeline, everything before and everything after. Of course, it was very simplistic and untrue picture of the world. Everybody understand it, even kids. But everybody else in the Western world, when I immigrated quite early, actually repeat the same idea of revolution. And in the Western world, the time also linear. That's why we accumulate in debts, that Michael Hudson point. And in this case, Carnival and Bakhtin writings maybe, so that's a question to you, maybe actually describing other world that the time is circular, because Carnival is not only putting things upside down, it's also constantly repeating. Carnival starting with like changes of, it's always at the end of the winter and the beginning of the spring. We know that it will come back. And it's not necessarily that it could function as the world, like commercial carnivals in Venice, for example, now, but it also could be very different. Original Venetian carnival was, I think, for 3 months or something like that. So it was a big part of restructuring society and allowing everybody who was actually pirates and refugees in Venice originally, to live through these changes of hierarchy when you're not able to go to the office or to anywhere without mask. So you're kind of forced to be somebody else or experience yourself.
Yeah, no, and I think this is one way that Carnival can in fact be very liberating, because it does give people the opportunity to step into the alternative selves that they might otherwise occupy, if not for, as you said, Nika, these linear systems of thought or social organization. In the West, it's not necessarily geographic. It really has to do with our economic development. Our economic development is based on a linear notion of time that is inherently teleological. It's a progress narrative. You're going towards something specific. Whereas the medieval way of thinking, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why Bakhtin was interested in it, it presents us with a different model of temporal experience where time occurs in cycles, right? And the cycles repeat. I can say that the most kind of profound example of Carnival that I've witnessed in my own experience, my own life, as funny as this will sound, perhaps, is at these events that I now try to avoid as much as possible. But that would be, I remember this in Boston once, and they do it annually in Ann Arbor, where I live, where the University of Michigan is located. In Ann Arbor, it's called Hash Bash. That is to say, and I can't actually remember what it was called in Boston, but the idea is, and it refers to a period of American conservative legal policy regarding marijuana, which was, which occupies this weird schizophrenic kind of place in the American consciousness as being something that's quite readily available and often used, and at the same time is classed in the same with the same legal status as heroin, and can be very dangerous to people if they're caught in certain jurisdictions with this. And yet in both Boston, I remember as a student, and then this is an annual event still going back to, I believe, the 1960s in Ann Arbor, there is one day, usually in April. In fact, I think it's officially on April 20th because it's 420, which is the criminal code for marijuana possession. And the entire center of campus, what's called the Diag, which is effectively our town square, is occupied by people who are publicly and rather extravagantly consuming marijuana. That is not just in little joints. They have these enormous, right? It's really quite carnivalesque. And of course, they're dressed in carnival fashion. They're wearing extravagant outfits. There's music and there's speakers, etc. It's very much a celebration of counterculture. And all around this space, there will be police not enforcing the law, but standing at the edges of the space to make sure that no one crosses out of the zone of carnival behavior, because if you cross out, now you are illegally consuming drugs in public. But as long as you are in the square, we're just going to look the other way. And in Boston, in particular, I remember it was a part of the public garden, or the Boston Commons rather, that was cordoned off with those metal barricades that they use for crowd control. And the police were all ringing around it, and they were just like it was like they were watching TV. They were pointing out, oh, look at that idiot. And they're like, they're having a great time. And everyone was, in effect, behaving carnivally, but within the rules, because even the people who were celebrating the counterculture, they knew, I can't do this on April 25th. It has to be April 20th, right? It's within the carnival temporal spatial designation. But, and this gets back to your point, Ika, this was a regular habit in certain college towns, primarily in the United States, from the 60s up until the early 2000s. And while this is not some great policy accomplishment of the kind that I would like to see, it is nevertheless the case that same behavior that was considered carnivalesque as late as the early 2000s is entirely legal in the United States now. It has completely changed the popular attitudes toward this particular behavior. And you can imagine that happening in lots of other categories of behavior. This is you might think of this as a slightly frivolous test case. It is possible to transform societal behavior simply by designating a time when it's okay. And then you show people it's not scary. And then you show people it's also not special, right? And it simply becomes a different way of life.
Yeah, great example. It's also in the framework of very rigid American culture. And some other cultures have different examples of how Carnival is functioning if they have a different framework. So, and that's all anthropology. That's why I think for David, it was so dear, these books, Bakhtin and Dostoevsky both. Mm-hmm. And he was saying that his first book that he loved the most, the whole ideas was packed there. Magic and Slavery in Madagascar was actually rewriting the Dostoevsky polyphonic novel. And yeah, and thank you so much. I really love especially the last part about ethical narrative and what is human life. Yeah, that's make a lot of sense for me. So we will have a working group now on Zoom about our hopefully future Carnival in Kibera in Nairobi in 2026. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.